was the one thing that I could take away from this that I thought was good. Because even in the opening of this every episode, it's like, well, how God can move in broken places. So what did you feel like in this podcast that was something that you could take something good out of this from this story?
Something good that I could take out was the reconciliation where possible. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there are some people that just wouldn't reconcile anything. And I'm blanking on the guy's name, but the guy that was essentially the CEO.
Oh, it was I want to say his last name was Sutton, but I can't think of his first
Yes,
name.
Sutton,
Yeah,
yeah, or
Sutton.
Sutton Turner, maybe, yeah.
Sutton Turner, yeah,
So,
that's where you go.
yeah, so I mean, the fact that he's been able to mend some bridges, and the fact that some of the churches were still able to continue to work under a different name even after Mark left it, and they were still able to serve the communities. Like, I think that was good, you know. But I know that another question you'd already asked me was what I might have learned through this podcast, and it's something that I kind of wanted to say, like, and it was something that's been going on outside of the podcast, but I've been learning a lot about the sin of scandal.
Mm.
I don't know if you really know, like, I mean, I know that you are probably more read than a lot of people, but like, I think that even like in the American church, we don't think of ourselves as belonging to anybody else,
Hmm.
and the thing I think I took away the most that I think that could be good, that could be really good, is that, we have a responsibility to each other. Like, we are supposed to be a community, but as we saw in this example of Mars Hill, and I mean, it's not like in a vacuum. Like, this happens all over the place. Everybody's like, well, you can't tell me what to do. Like, I'm going to do what I want, whether or not it causes somebody else to stumble. you
Mm-hmm.
know and I mean, like, I do think that there are some lines that you can kind of like draw in the sand and say, you know if this is making somebody stumble, like, it's probably not as much me. But I do believe that, and I mean, especially with somebody like a pastor like Mark Driscoll, like, he led a lot of people to sin, you know and we all do it. And
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a sin of an action or a sin of omission, but I mean, honestly, my prayer is that, like, if anything really good can come out of this, is that people will see that, everything that we do affects somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So.
and I would highlight that sentiment with the idea that, from being a pastor and also just being a regular churchgoer, it's very easy for people to get offended by
Mhm.
another person's actions, whether me as a pastor, I may say something or do something that may offend somebody, um, whether I was in the wrong or whether it's not. It was just more of a personality thing. um,
Mhm.
those things, we could either just ignore them and allow that hurt and pain to continue to go on,
Mhm.
or we can have that time of reconciliation. And I think the times where people may have had some issues with, whether it's my leadership or maybe if I had some issues with something that may have been said or done, I was never one to back away from confronting someone in a more of a gentle way, for a gentle
Mhm.
rebuke if I saw something. Um,
Mhm.
so when those happen, and when it was kind of met with open arms, met with fruitful, met from learning, met from a growing perspective, great healing could come from that. And I think that was kind of one of the highlights that we saw from Sutton's story, is that,
Exactly.
he tried to really reach out and try to connect with people. And if he found himself back in Seattle, he was going to meet those people. And I
Mhm.
think even there was one part where he said, I was there for 3 days. I met with one family, talked with them for like 3 hours. And even at the end of the
Mhm.
3 hours, they were like, yeah, hey, we appreciate you talking to you, but we still don't forgive you.
Mhm.
And he's like, okay, that's, he did his best. He tried his best to make amends, and they just weren't ready to forgive him. And then it was like, he's in Texas and randomly he gets a call. And then all of a sudden it's like the same guy go, hey, we just want to let you know we forgive you now. There was at least a time healing. But I think in order for that to happen, there had to be that humility of saying, hey, I'm sorry I wronged you. Let's talk about it. Let's try to hash things out. And I think that was kind of the big thing that I could take away from, was just like, wow, that was something that I thought was really powerful. I think for me, something that I can learn from is just how much, for me, I think it's how much important it is for those who are in leadership, especially those who are like on an elder board or any type of committee that works with the pastor, works with leaders in the church, how unequipped they are to actually lead, and how unequipped they are to really handle sensitive matters. And especially, I think it's important and again, you go to, for me, and even for you, we go to school, we learn stuff. And for me, I learned how to be a pastor, learn how to do all this stuff. And it's basically all this knowledge and experience on how to be a pastor, do all these things. But for your person who may be a plumber or an accountant, when they get asked to serve on the elder board, they have no experience on how to lead. And even when you look at the instructions we see of the qualifications of an elder in Timothy, it's like, you have to be this, you have to be this, don't do this, don't do this. And you're really not sure, well, how do I navigate through something, which, I appreciate books like Scott McKnight and Laura Brenigan's A Church Called Tove, where they kind of highlight, here's what a good church culture looks like. And here's how, how if you don't have these things in place, how things get really bad. And sometimes your leaders can kind of just be like, well, we don't know what to do, or we're trying to do our best, but we've kind of, take instructions from the person in charge. And sometimes that may not necessarily be the best thing. So I think that was the one thing that I learned from this podcast. And then kind of my final question, just kind of highlighting this podcast, is what is something in this podcast that you wish was addressed more, or something that needed to be highlighted a little bit more than that wasn't?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it goes back to the thesis of, we all killed Mars Hill. Again, like, it was a lot of the firsthand account, and I think that it was a great story, and I was enamored with it. And I honestly, it felt like, what am I going to do now that it's over? I was in show hole, or whatever they call it. I was just like, it was riveting. But, I went back, and it wasn't Mark Driscoll by himself. It wasn't the leadership team by himself. Like, they were the tip of the iceberg, right? But like, what about everybody under the water that was holding them up? And I don't feel like that was fully explored. And, the tragedy is that the church, little c church, the human institution, is going to go up against that like the Titanic every time, and it's going to sink, because it's immovable. Like, it can't be taught. It can't be, it doesn't take humility seriously, and why do we want to hang on to these cults of personality? And I mean, and that could be taken in the religious sense, or even in the political sense now. I mean, I feel like you could talk about that for years.
Oh yeah.
And never, get to the bottom of it. But, how can we stop? How can we refrain from repeating our mistakes if we don't know why we make them in the first place?
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that's good. Because even, if, one of the deconstruction podcasts, which, at the time of recording, it's supposed to air this Friday. So this is the week of the 14th. So this Friday, it's actually Emily's story. And, she kind of talks a little bit about the idea of church kind of almost being like a cult. And I think you're kind of hitting it on the head. I know I might get some fire for that, but when you there was a podcast I used to listen to called Cults, and they really looked at all these different cults, and they kind of always say, well, here are the three things that make a cult. And one of the first things is that you have a very charismatic leader, someone who is very charismatic, very outgoing, someone who's very, in some ways, kind of narcissistic in some ways, but there's someone that people can really entice people and bring people into their camp and really, and to the point where people can follow this person. And then, of course, the other thing, and I think it's the third thing, I can't remember the second thing, but the third thing is that sometimes the rules that the leader puts in place are also rules that the leader doesn't follow as well.
Of course. Yeah.
So yeah. So, that was one thing in the podcast they kept saying, Mark always kept talking about grace and the grace of God. And yet you never really saw that played out. He talked about it, but you never really see that played out from him. Maybe a few occasions, maybe in the early years of Mars Hill, you saw that, but towards the end, when things started blowing up and you kind of have that whole celebrity cult of personality thing, then it's like, well, now the grace of God is starting to get less and less from the person who continues to keep preaching about grace. And I think that's kind of a big issue. For me, the thing I wish they would have dived in a little bit more was the idea of finding God in broken places. I feel like it was talked about. And I feel like even in a lot of the episodes, there might be like maybe one particular episode where they would highlight it. But then when I got to the aftermath, I was thinking, okay, let's hear about all this stuff. And we got to hear about some of these like satellite churches, how funds were able to be distributed. And they kind of talked a little bit about the numbers and how bad their finances were and how they were able to do all these things. But the idea that, hey, this church closed, but then these two churches merged. So you got to see that people were able to rebrand and re-identify away from kind of the Mars Hill. You even see like some of the guys started a company and hire people to work from them. So then that way they could kind of not have to put Mars Hill on the resume because they knew that that was going to be a career killer in the Seattle area. Oh, you worked at Mars Hill with Mark Driscoll? No, thanks. Like you're done. Like they could be really good at their job, but because they're associated with kind of had that dark cloud over them, it was like, so they're able to help out with that. But then you also had stories of people who are really still dealing with a lot of trauma. Some have even taken their own lives. And I just felt like as we got to the end, I almost wish that entire episode, or at least the last two episodes, really focused on the reconciliation, the healing part, what people are doing, where are they now, how are they healing from this, and everything else. And I felt like I never got that. I just felt like it was shocking. Here's this tragedy. Here's a little thing. Like even, I think it was probably a couple episodes. I want to say maybe episode 9, where, you heard about the Smiths being fired and letting go and not signing the NDA. And then, the church started GoFundMe, and, you hear that story and it's like, well, that's great. And that's wonderful. And I've heard that story from Jen previously before this podcast start, that they were able to do that, and how wonderful, but even how painful that was. Like it was hard for her to see, because it's like, we just been through this traumatic thing at the church, and here is the church pouring out this love. And it was very conflicting. It was very paradoxical for them of, you had that hope and hurt kind of colliding right there in that moment. And I wish that there would have been more of that. And I felt like you only got it from a couple key players, but you never really got it from a lot. And even the times where Mike Cosper would come on and say, hey, we're just still getting more interviews, more people are talking, more people. I'm like, okay, that's great. And yet I never really got that.
Yeah.
I think that was the one thing that's like, well, if you're going to end your kind of your opener with, and how God's working in broken places, and yet that was only probably about 1/8 of the podcast.
Hmm. Well, you know, and I can definitely sympathize with that because I do think that it was a fairly depressing show overall.
No,
But at
yeah.
the same time, like, do we run the risk of whitewashing what happened
Hmm.
by focusing on too much of that, you know?
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, it's not necessarily like, I mean, there's definitely a balance, and I don't know if we would ever get it right for everybody,
Hmm.
but you know, I definitely get that. But I mean, I do think that it could have used a little more cheeriness,
Hmm.
you
Yeah,
know.
and I agree with you, because I mean it's very Christian like to be able to take tragedy and turn it into something positive.
Yeah.
And I think, and that's the thing, I felt like, with that balance being hard, I didn't want the last episode. See, even though you've heard all these, a majority of episodes were just tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. And then we're going to go ahead and just say, but guess what? Everything's all better now. Everybody
Yeah.
got help. Everybody is emotionally and spiritually healthy. Everybody's going back to church. Everything's great. Like, yeah, we can get that. And I'm glad that they didn't. At the same time, I wish there was a little bit more. I wish there was almost kind of
Yeah.
like that, not necessarily a silver lining, but something where you can kind of see a ray of hope shining through the dark clouds that we have just
Mhm.
experienced.
Yeah, and I think that would be cool. Something that I was kind of thinking about when you were talking about having that. I've also been wrestling with this thought of like the fact that, you know, Jesus went to the cross, you know, and kind of it changed the trajectory of the cross, you know, but he never took away the pain,
Exactly. Hmm.
you know. And I think that maybe part of why we are left with so much pain, aside from the fact that we're still in a fallen world, is that one of the biggest causes of that pain has never once taken any responsibility. You
Mm.
know, like how can we, in a sense, grow without, I mean, we can grow. Like the Lord is faithful, and he's going to give us the things that we need, even if the person who offended us never comes back and says, hey, I'm really sorry for what I did. Like,
Yeah.
you know, but like I think that it needs to hurt because, you know, kind of what Mark and a lot of people like him preach, they preach this form of prosperity gospel, like you do this, this, and this, you're going to have eternal life, everything's going to be great. But like, no, we're sitting here in the crap that we all do to each other, you know, and maybe we need to actually sit in it more and reflect on what's going on in our lives and the lives around us. You know, I don't know. I don't mean to rain on your parade. Like
No,
I
no, no,
just,
no.
you
You're
know,
fine. No, great thoughts, Phil. Great thoughts. And I think, yeah, I think that's kind of the big piece. And I think that's even, and maybe another thing that's surprising to me is that, we have this documented history from people's testimonies, from emails, from, even if you want to go back to, pulling out the old chat rooms, and you have the
yeah.
pseudonym William Wallace and all the
Hmm.
crazy things that were said, that you find out later it was actually Mark Driscoll saying it. Um, I'm just shocked and surprised that even though there's a well documented history, why someone, whether that's the Reformed movement, whether it's someone, would say, you know what, let's go ahead and give this guy a church and let him do things. And I don't want to say that like,
Hmm.
well, no, people can't ever, pastors who have fallen from grace or have had moral failings or have had some type of controversy with them, that they can't go and be pastors again. I'm not saying that, but I
Hmm.
would say if there's some type of reconciliation that can be done and some type
Hmm.
of healing that can take place, then I would think that someone would say, well, have you reconciled with those you have wounded? And if you have, then I'm more than happy to say, okay, yeah, take the pulpit. We'll
Mhm.
put some guidelines. We'll have some accountability. We'll make sure we'll give you the tools to succeed, but also the tools to make sure that you are being taken care of, and that if you start kind of getting a little loose, we'll rebuke you and try to get you back on, back on the right path. But the fact that he's pastoring, and even some of the same, like even I was on Twitter last night, and I don't
Mhm.
know what it was, but because I follow a lot of like pastors and church leaders and stuff, and it seemed like everybody and their mom goes, I don't know what I said because I don't really correspond with him, but all of a sudden they're being blocked by Mark Driscoll. Like he has banned them or blocked them from seeing any of his tweets. And I'm thinking, they're like, maybe guilt by association because I'm, friends with this person. But for the most part, I don't have any, and I don't interact with them. Why did I get blocked? And it was just like a mass blocking. And it's like, there's some of these signs and some of these breadcrumbs that are kind of alluding to the same type of behavior that happened at Mars Hill.
Mhm.
And there's a part of me that goes, well, why is that not who are the people in Arizona that are now addressing this, that are kind of keeping him accountable and saying, hey, why are you just massively blocking a bunch of people? What's going on? Like, what's happening?
Yeah.
Like, who knows? Like, I could probably go on to Twitter and I'm blocked because this podcast came out, and you're blocked too
Yeah.
if you're on Twitter.
Oh no, I gave up Twitter a long time ago.
Yes.
It's bad for my health.
Believe me, there's a lot of apps that are bad for your health.
Yeah, and I mean, I've gotten rid of all social media off of my phone. So if I'm
Yeah.
on it, it's on the computer. It's very intentional. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
and the thing about Mark Driscoll and people like him is that like we want to have that popularity. We want
Mhm.
that kind of charisma, and we're drawn to it, you know. And I keep having this quote kind of go back and forth in my mind, and you can bleep it out or what, but Mark may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. It's
Yeah.
kind of and that's kind of like the way it went, like when he started playing the victim narrative, like, oh, we had this dispute, there was a trap set for me,
Mhm.
all this kind of stuff. And then everybody's like, well, none of us are free from sin. So let's just go ahead and forgive this guy of everything that he's ever done, even though there's no heart of repentance at all.
Mhm.
And that's a problem with the church worldwide. I don't think that that's just an American thing. I mean, I think that there are some churches that have a better handle on that than others, whether they're institutional or just one-off churches. But
Yeah.
you know like I and again, like, I just think that we need to address this. Why do we continue falling for something that is less than what God has for us, and
Mm.
being like, and kind of like when I was listening to your friend Ryan, I think it
Yeah.
was
Mhm.
recently, and he was when he was talking about orthopraxy, and I thought, that's amazing. Like, why don't we talk about that more often?
Mhm.
Like, we, right thinking is nothing unless we, put it into practice. And
Yeah.
I don't think that the church is doing a very good job of putting things into practice, myself included. So,
Yeah. And yeah, and there's a whole lot we can explore there.
hey,
Um,
we can keep talking some other time, like,
yeah, definitely. You might have to shoot me a note, go, hey, let's talk about these things so we can go back to, because I'll probably forget by the time I get to pick up my daughter from preschool, because that's just how
yeah.
my brain works. It's like you jump in the shower and you have all these great ideas. Or
Hmm.
back when I was doing music, I'd come up with these great song lyrics. I'm like, oh man, I'm singing in the shower. I'm like, oh man, this is great. And then it's like right when that water turns off and the towel goes around me, it's like, I can't remember anything I just sang in that shower. I was too busy having fun. Even if I'm just like spitting rap verses and I'm like, oh man, I should definitely record this. Like, no, I can't. It's all gone now.
Get a waterproof recorder.
Oh yeah, but back when I was a kid, they didn't have those things yet. Maybe like one of those big, like, what were they called, like Talk Boys from like Home Alone 2. Maybe they could
Oh, I
survive on
wanted one of
water
those
with
so bad. Oh my gosh. My parents never got me one, and I don't think I forgave them for a long time.
I don't think I ever got one either, because I was just like,
Yeah.
nah, I don't want one. That wasn't my thing. So kind of to wrap up the show, for those of you who have listened to this, if you have not listened to The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, you can just find it, just do a search in any podcast. Wherever you listen to your podcast, you just do a search for Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. And you definitely can listen to it. But again, I think it's great. And we like to know what you think. If you listen to it, please just share your thoughts and let us know what you thought of the series. And if you agree or disagree with Phil and I's kind of view of the podcast and some of our thoughts, we definitely would like to hear some of the things that you took away from it, the good, the bad, and also the ugly. So guys, again, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great rest of 2021, and I will see you in 2022. Take care. Bye.